So we learned a lot throughout this section. We learned how to pass data around, how to get access to elements in our DOM, how to use local references. So our application now is much more dynamic. We got much more tools to interact between the different pieces we have in our app. Now, there is another way we can pass data around, the last way for now. In our server element component here, right now we check if we have a type server or a type blueprint server, right? Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you have complex HTML code like this, which you want to pass into a component from outside. So imagine you don't want to set this up inside the component here. I cut it. Instead, in the app component, you somehow want to add this here between the opening and closing element of your own component. And there we simply would have to replace element with server element. And we should expect this to work, right? So if we save this and let it reload and we add a new server, we don't get an error, but the content is also not there. And that is the default behavior. Everything you place between the opening and closing tag of your own component is lost by default, is simply removed from the DOM. Angular will not take care about it. But you can change this. There is a special directive, and it is a directive even though it looks like a component, but it doesn't have its own template. A special directive you can add in the server element components template here. In the place where I want to render the content, I can add ng content. Opening and closing, again, it still is a directive, just using this element-like selector. And this serves as a hook you can place in your component to mark the place for Angular where it should add any content it finds between the opening and closing tag here. So this content in this case. With this tiny addition, you should see that once you save this and let it reload, if we add this, and we click Add Server, you now see the content is back. It looks exactly the way it looked before, but technically something totally different works or happens here. Now we add this via the ng content hook. We add it between the opening and closing tags, and therefore it will be projected into your component, projected into your server element component. A nice feature, especially if you think about building reusable widgets, like a tab widget, where each tab will have a content which probably comes from some other source and which you don't want to pass through property binding, which always would be an alternative. But if it's more complex HTML code, property binding really is not the best solution because Angular will escape HTML tags there to prevent cross-site scripting attacks from happening, and you could kind of work around that, but really ng content then is how you want to display this, and that is a great tool to have at your disposal.